The year is 1787. In a sweltering room in Philadelphia, 55 men are creating something unprecedented in human history, a government designed to serve the people rather than extract wealth from them. James Madison scribbles notes about limiting corporate power. Thomas Jefferson writes letters warning that banking institutions and moneyed-in corporations are more dangerous to liberty than standing armies. Alexander Hamilton argues that the new government must never become a mere instrument of commercial interests. Fast forward to 2023. The Pentagon signs a $10 billion cloud computing contract with Amazon. Goldman Sachs executives shuttle between Wall Street and the Treasury Department through a revolving door that spins so fast it's practically a turbine. Corporate lobbyists literally write the legislation that Congress passes without reading. The Federal Reserve, a private banking cartel, controls the money supply of the most powerful nation on earth. And when you call your congressman's office, there's a decent chance you'll reach a former corporate executive who now writes policy for the industry they used to represent. What happened? How did a government created to constrain corporate power become indistinguishable from a subsidiary of corporate America? How did the United States of America become USA in key? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the hidden transformations that reshaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below telling us what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to discover isn't just the story of American government. It's a masterclass in how democratic institutions can be captured, transformed, and weaponized by the very interests they were designed to control. This transformation didn't happen through revolution or war. It happened through a series of seemingly incremental changes, each one appearing reasonable in isolation, but collectively adding up to the most sophisticated capture of democratic government in human history. The men who engineered this transformation understood something that most citizens never realized. You don't need to overthrow democracy to control it. You just need to make it profitable to the right people. The story begins not with the obvious villains, the robber barons and corporate raiders, but with a group of progressive reformers who thought they were saving democracy from corporate control. Their solution to corporate corruption would become the very instrument of corporate capture. In 1883, a disgruntled office seeker named Charles Guiteau assassinated President James Garfield because he didn't receive the patronage appointment he believed he deserved. The assassination shocked America into confronting the reality that their government had become a vast spoils system where public jobs were bought and sold like commodities. The reform movement that emerged demanded scientific management and professional administration to replace the corrupt patronage system. Led by intellectuals like Woodrow Wilson, who had written extensively about bringing business efficiency to government, these reformers argued that governance was too complex and technical for ordinary citizens to understand. Wilson's solution was revolutionary. Create a professional administrative class that would run the government using scientific principles rather than political considerations. The field of administration is a field of business, Wilson wrote in 1887. It is removed from the hurry and strife of politics. It needs business methods and business efficiency. This sounds reasonable, even admirable. Who could argue against efficiency and expertise? But Wilson's reforms contained a hidden trap that he never anticipated. When you model government on business principles, you create institutions that naturally serve business interests. The first major test of this new administrative state came during World War I when Wilson faced the unprecedented challenge of mobilizing an entire economy for military production. Traditional government departments lacked the expertise and connections to coordinate with private industry on the scale required. Wilson's solution was to recruit business leaders directly into government positions, creating what historian Gabriel Kolko called the new partnership between business and government. Bernard Baruch, a Wall Street financier, became chairman of the War Industries Board. Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer and entrepreneur, ran the Food Administration. Corporate executives took leave from their companies to run government agencies that regulated their former employers. This arrangement was supposed to be temporary, a wartime emergency measure. But it established a precedent that would prove irresistible to future administrations facing complex challenges. When government needed expertise, it would borrow that expertise from the private sector. When it needed efficiency, it would adopt business methods. When it needed legitimacy, it would recruit business leaders who commanded public respect. The partnership worked in the narrow sense that America successfully mobilized for war. But it also began to blur the distinction between public service and private profit in ways that the Founding Fathers would have found alarming. The real transformation began during the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt faced an economic crisis so severe that traditional government approaches seemed hopelessly inadequate. Like Wilson before him, Roosevelt turned to business leaders and business methods to solve public problems. But Roosevelt went further than Wilson in a crucial way. He didn't just borrow business expertise, he began to structure government agencies using corporate organizational models. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created as a government-owned corporation. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation operated like a private investment bank using public funds. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was designed to function like a private insurance company. These hybrid institutions were supposed to combine the efficiency of private enterprise with the public accountability of democratic government. But they actually created something new: government agencies that thought like corporations but operated with sovereign power. This might seem like a technical administrative detail, but it had profound implications. Corporate thinking prioritizes efficiency, profitability, and competitive advantage. Democratic thinking prioritizes accountability, equity, and public participation. When government agencies adopt corporate thinking, they begin to treat citizens like customers rather than stakeholders, and they begin to measure success in terms of operational metrics rather than democratic values. Even more significantly, Roosevelt's corporate-style government agencies created natural partnerships with private corporations that shared their organizational culture and operational methods. It became easier for government officials to communicate with corporate executives than with elected representatives or ordinary citizens, because they spoke the same language and shared the same assumptions about how organizations should function. This trend accelerated dramatically during World War II, when the Roosevelt administration created what historian Jennifer Light calls the military-industrial complex, a permanent partnership between government agencies and private corporations that would outlast the war and become a defining feature of American governance. The scale of this partnership was unprecedented. By 1945, the federal government was spending more than 40% of the national economy, much of it through contracts with private companies that manufactured everything from ammunition to aircraft carriers. Corporate executives rotated freely between government positions and private sector jobs. Military officers retired to lucrative positions with defense contractors. Congressional committees developed close relationships with the industries they were supposed to regulate. But the most significant change was cultural. Government officials began to see themselves as managers of a large enterprise rather than servants of democratic institutions. They adopted corporate metrics like cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, and operational efficiency as measures of good governance. They began to think in terms of strategic planning, market positioning, and competitive advantage rather than constitutional principles, democratic participation, and public accountability. This corporate mindset became so pervasive that it seemed natural and inevitable. Who could argue against efficiency? Who wanted government to be ineffective or wasteful? But efficiency and effectiveness aren't neutral values. They're shaped by how you define success, and corporate definitions of success are fundamentally different from democratic definitions of success. The transformation accelerated rapidly during the Cold War, when national security concerns provided justification for unprecedented government secrecy, corporate partnerships, and concentration of executive power. President Dwight Eisenhower, despite his famous warning about the military-industrial complex, actually strengthened the partnership between government and corporation during his administration. Eisenhower believed that America's survival depended on outcompeting the Soviet Union in technological innovation, which required close cooperation between government agencies and private corporations. The results were impressive from a technological standpoint. Satellite communications, computer networks, jet aircraft, nuclear power, and eventually the internet all emerged from government-corporate partnerships during this period. But these technological successes came at a democratic cost that most Americans didn't recognize until much later. Government agencies began to operate with levels of secrecy that would have been unthinkable in peacetime democracies. Corporate contractors gained access to classified information and government decision-making processes that gave them enormous advantages over competitors who lacked security clearances. Military officers and intelligence officials developed closer relationships with corporate executives than with elected representatives who were excluded from classified briefings. Most importantly, the national security rationale created exceptions to normal democratic oversight that quickly expanded beyond military and intelligence agencies. Highway construction, urban renewal, scientific research, and education policy all became national security issues that justified reduced public participation and increased corporate involvement. This expansion of the national security state created what political scientist Daniel Carpenter calls administrative capture, the process by which government agencies become more responsive to the industries they're supposed to regulate than to the elected officials who are supposed to control them. Administrative capture wasn't the result of corruption in the traditional sense. Government officials weren't taking bribes or engaging in obviously illegal behavior. Instead, they were gradual socialization into communities where corporate interests and government interests seemed naturally aligned. Consider the career of Robert McNamara, who exemplified this new type of government official. McNamara spent the early part of his career at Ford Motor Company, where he became famous for applying quantitative analysis and systems thinking to complex organizational challenges. In 1961, President Kennedy recruited McNamara to serve as Secretary of Defense, where he applied the same analytical methods to military planning. McNamara genuinely believed he was bringing scientific rigor to government decision-making. He created sophisticated metrics for measuring military effectiveness, cost-benefit analyses for evaluating weapons systems, and strategic planning processes borrowed from corporate management. He surrounded himself with other former business executives who shared his faith in quantitative analysis and systematic management. But McNamara's corporate approach to government led directly to some of the worst policy disasters in American history. His quantitative metrics for measuring success in Vietnam led military commanders to focus on body counts rather than political progress. His cost-benefit analyses justified weapons systems that were expensive failures. His strategic planning processes created elaborate war plans that bore no relationship to political realities in Southeast Asia. McNamara's failures weren't personal character flaws. They were the inevitable result of applying corporate thinking to democratic governance. Corporations can afford to make strategic mistakes because market feedback eventually corrects errors through profit and loss. Democracies can't afford to make strategic mistakes because political feedback often comes too late to prevent catastrophic consequences. But instead of learning from McNamara's failures, subsequent administrations doubled down on corporate approaches to government. The solution to failed corporate thinking was always more sophisticated corporate thinking. This trend reached its logical conclusion during the 1980s when Ronald Reagan explicitly declared that government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Reagan's solution was to make government more like private enterprise through deregulation, privatization, and what he called market-based solutions to public problems. Reagan's reforms weren't just about reducing the size of government. They were about fundamentally changing the character of government by importing corporate methods, corporate personnel, and corporate values into public institutions. The language of governance began to change in obvious ways. Citizens became customers. Public services became products. Government agencies became service providers. Democratic accountability became performance measurement. Constitutional rights became value propositions. But the deeper change was in how government officials understood their roles and responsibilities. Instead of seeing themselves as public servants accountable to democratic institutions, they began to see themselves as managers of public enterprises, competing in various markets for resources, attention, and legitimacy. This managerial mindset had profound implications for democratic governance. Managers are accountable to shareholders, boards of directors, and market forces. Public servants are accountable to voters, elected representatives, and constitutional principles. These are fundamentally different forms of accountability that create different incentives and different behaviors. When government officials think like managers, They naturally gravitate toward partnerships with other managers in the private sector who understand their challenges and share their methods. They become impatient with democratic processes that seem inefficient compared to corporate decision-making. They begin to see public participation as an obstacle to effective management rather than an essential component of democratic legitimacy. Reagan's corporate revolution was consolidated during the 1990s by Bill Clinton, who embraced what he called reinventing government through partnerships with private industry and adoption of business practices. Clinton's approach was more sophisticated than Reagan's crude anti-government rhetoric. Instead of attacking government directly, Clinton argued that government should become more entrepreneurial, more customer-focused, and more results-oriented. These sound like admirable goals, but they represented a fundamental shift away from democratic values toward corporate values. The Clinton administration pioneered what political scientist Paul Light calls government by contract. The practice of using private corporations to deliver public services while maintaining the fiction of public accountability. Instead of reducing government, this approach actually expanded government influence while reducing government responsibility. Private corporations began to run prisons, manage welfare systems, operate schools, provide military services, and even collect taxes on behalf of government agencies. These companies were accountable to their shareholders and government contracts, but not directly to the citizens who received their services or paid for them through taxes. Even more significantly, the Clinton administration embraced what economists call market-based regulation. The practice of using financial incentives rather than legal requirements to influence corporate behavior. Instead of prohibiting harmful activities, government agencies began to create markets in pollution credits, development rights, and other commodities that allowed corporations to buy their way out of regulatory compliance. This market-based approach was supposed to be more efficient than traditional command and control regulation, and in some narrow economic senses it was. But it also transformed the relationship between government and corporations from adversarial to collaborative. Regulatory agencies became partners with the industries they regulated rather than independent watchdogs protecting public interests. The culmination of this transformation came during the George W. Bush administration, when the logic of corporate government was extended to its ultimate conclusion: the privatization of war itself. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were the first major American conflicts fought primarily by private contractors rather than government employees. Companies like Halliburton, Blackwater, and dozens of others provided everything from food services and transportation to intelligence analysis and combat operations. By 2008, private contractors outnumbered uniformed military personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan. This privatization of war represented the final abandonment of the principle that sovereign power should be exercised only by public officials accountable to democratic institutions. Private contractors were accountable to their corporate employers and government contracts, but not to military commanders, congressional oversight, or international law in the same way that government employees were. The results were predictable and disastrous. Private contractors engaged in torture, killed civilians, and committed war crimes that damaged America's international reputation and undermined military objectives. When scandals emerged, corporate executives could claim they were just following government contracts, while government officials could claim they were not responsible for contractors' actions. But the privatization of war was just the most visible example of a broader phenomenon: the transformation of government from a democratic institution into a corporate enterprise more concerned with operational efficiency than democratic accountability. This transformation accelerated dramatically after the 2008 financial crisis, when the Obama administration's response revealed how completely government and corporate interests had merged. When major financial institutions faced collapse due to reckless speculation and fraudulent practices, the Obama administration's response was not to prosecute the corporate executives responsible or restructure the financial industry. Instead, it bailed out the same institutions that had caused the crisis and allowed them to continue operating with minimal changes. The justification was pure corporate thinking. These institutions were too big to fail, meaning their collapse would cause unacceptable damage to the broader economy. But this logic made private corporations systemically important in ways that gave them veto power over government policy. If financial institutions were too big to fail, they were also too big to regulate effectively. Even more revealing was the personnel Obama recruited to manage the financial crisis. Timothy Geithner came directly from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where he had worked closely with the same Wall Street firms he was now supposed to regulate. Lawrence Summers had earned millions of dollars consulting for Wall Street firms between his government positions. The Obama administration's economic team was composed almost entirely of people whose careers had been built on the revolving door between government service and private sector profits. This wasn't corruption in the traditional sense. These officials genuinely believed they were serving the public interest by stabilizing the financial system. But their definition of the public interest was shaped by their professional networks, intellectual frameworks, and career incentives, all of which aligned closely with the interests of large financial institutions. The Obama administration's approach to governing extended this corporate logic to virtually every area of domestic policy. Healthcare reform was designed around partnerships with insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations, rather than direct government provision of medical services. Education reform was based on charter schools and standardized testing rather than democratic control of public schools. Environmental policy relied on market-based mechanisms like carbon trading rather than direct regulation of polluting industries. In each case, the administration's approach was more sophisticated and politically palatable than crude privatization, but it achieved the same result. The transformation of government from a democratic institution into a facilitator of corporate profits. This transformation reached its logical extreme during the Trump administration, when the pretense of separation between government and corporate interests was largely abandoned. Trump appointed corporate executives directly to cabinet positions without requiring them to fully divest from their business interests. His Environmental Protection Agency was run by former industry lobbyists. His Federal Communications Commission was staffed with former telecommunications industry executives. His Treasury Department was managed by former Wall Street executives who maintained close ties to their former employers. But Trump's approach was actually more honest than his predecessors' more sophisticated forms of corporate capture. By appointing obvious corporate representatives to government positions, Trump made visible the conflicts of interest that had been hidden by the revolving door between government and industry. The Trump administration's explicit embrace of corporate interests revealed how completely the original constitutional design had been abandoned. The Founding Fathers had created a system of checks and balances to prevent any single interest from capturing government power. But corporate capture had been so gradual and so complete that it was no longer even controversial for government officials to explicitly serve corporate interests. This brings us to the present moment, when the transformation of government into a corporate subsidiary has become so complete that most Americans accept it as natural and inevitable. The Federal Reserve, which controls the money supply and financial system, is literally a private banking cartel owned by the banks it regulates. Corporate lobbyists write the legislation that Congress passes, often without modification. Major government contractors like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google provide essential services to military and intelligence agencies while simultaneously collecting data on the citizens those agencies are supposed to protect. The revolving door between government and industry spins so rapidly that it's difficult to identify any senior officials whose careers haven't been built on alternating between public service and private profit. Corporate executives take government positions to advance their industry's interests, then return to private sector positions that compensate them for their government service. Even more fundamentally, the language and logic of corporate management has become so pervasive in government that most officials can no longer think in terms of democratic values or constitutional principles. Government agencies measure their success using corporate metrics. Public policies are evaluated using cost-benefit analyses that treat citizens like consumers. Democratic participation is seen as an inefficient obstacle to effective management. This transformation has had predictable consequences for democratic governance. Citizens have lost faith in government institutions that seem more responsive to corporate interests than democratic input. Political representation has become meaningless when elected officials have less influence over policy than corporate lobbyists and government contractors. Most seriously, the constitutional system of checks and balances has been undermined by the creation of a permanent administrative state that operates according to corporate logic rather than democratic accountability. Congress cannot effectively oversee agencies staffed by former industry executives who will return to industry positions after their government service. Courts cannot effectively review decisions made through technical processes that require corporate expertise to understand. But the story doesn't end with complete corporate capture of democratic government. Around the world, citizens and reform movements are experimenting with ways to restore democratic control over public institutions and reassert the principle that government should serve citizens rather than corporations. Some of these experiments focus on structural reforms like campaign finance restrictions, lobbying regulations, and cooling off periods for officials moving between government and industry. Others focus on participatory mechanisms like citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting, and direct democracy initiatives that give citizens more direct control over government decisions. Still others focus on creating alternative institutions like public banks, cooperative enterprises, and municipal broadband networks that provide public services without relying on corporate partnerships. These experiments suggest that the corporate capture of government is not inevitable or irreversible, but reversing it will require sustained political movements that understand both the scope of the problem and the depth of change required to address it. The transformation of American government into a corporate subsidiary wasn't the result of a conspiracy or coup. It was the result of thousands of individual decisions made by well-intentioned people who believed they were improving government efficiency and effectiveness. But the cumulative effect of these decisions has been to create a system that serves corporate interests more effectively than democratic values. Reversing this transformation will require equally sustained effort by people who understand that democratic government and corporate management are fundamentally different enterprises that cannot be combined without destroying the essential characteristics of both. Democratic government requires transparency, accountability, and participation that are incompatible with corporate needs for secrecy, efficiency, and centralized control. Corporate management requires flexibility, competitiveness, and profit maximization that are incompatible with democratic needs for stability, equity, and public service. The choice facing American citizens is not between efficient government and inefficient government. It's between democratic government and corporate government. These represent fundamentally different approaches to organizing society that cannot be reconciled through technical reforms or administrative improvements. Restoring democratic government will require constitutional changes, cultural changes, and institutional changes that reassert the principle that sovereign power belongs to citizens rather than shareholders, that public officials serve democratic values rather than corporate interests, and that government exists to promote the general welfare rather than private profits. This restoration is possible, but only if citizens understand what they've lost and commit to the difficult work of rebuilding democratic institutions that actually serve democratic purposes. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden forces that reshape our world, but this particular story is still being written. Each of us, through our political choices, our economic decisions, and our civic participation, becomes an author of whether future generations will live under democratic government or corporate rule. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive if this exploration of government's corporate transformation revealed patterns you hadn't fully recognized before. Drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and share your thoughts. Do you see evidence of corporate influence in your local government? What would it take to restore democratic control over public institutions? How can citizens distinguish between legitimate expertise and corporate capture? The story of how the U.S. government became a corporation explains much about contemporary politics, but it doesn't determine our future. That future depends on whether Americans choose to accept corporate rule as inevitable or commit to the hard work of restoring government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The Constitution they wrote is still there. The question is whether we still have the democratic will to defend it.